The attendee list for the Taren sector's revised strategic framework briefing had been circulated to all participants 48 hours prior, which was the joint command protocol for briefings at the strategic consultation tier, and which Sora had used in the standard way, which was to review each name against her mental catalog of the Vareth and Joint Authority command structures, and to form preliminary assessments that the briefing would then verify or revise. The preliminary assessments were part of her preparation. She had been doing this since her first command briefing at 26 and had found, across 8 years of briefings, that the preliminary assessments were accurate approximately 85% of the time, and that the 15% that required revision were the most instructive moments of any briefing, because they were the moments when the gap between a category and a person became legible, and the gap's legibility was the most useful intelligence the briefing produced. She had not yet understood that the 15% had a direction, that the revisions were not random in the way of a calibration error being random, but were consistent in the specific way that the categories she was most confident about were the categories most likely to require revision, because confidence in a category was the thing that most reliably prevented accurate observation of the thing the category was supposed to describe. She would understand this by the end of the briefing. The name Garen Sols appeared in the attendee list's strategic consultation tier, designated as Senior Advisor, Joint Authority Veteran Consultant. She looked at the designation for a moment and then looked at the name. Neither was familiar. Senior Advisor with Veteran Consultant designation was a category she had encountered 4 times in Joint Command briefings, and had found, in all 4 instances, to be the category of former operational officers who had distinguished themselves in their active period, and who were present in the consultation tier for the institutional memory and political continuity value their distinguished past provided. She had found them, in all 4 instances, to be courteous and to offer historical context that was sometimes useful and sometimes not current enough to be operationally relevant, and which she had learned to receive with the respectful attention that the rank required, and to evaluate with the honest assessment that the content deserved. She had formed her preliminary assessment of Garen Sols from the designation and the unfamiliarity of the name, which were the only data points the list provided, and the preliminary assessment was consistent with her category's history. He entered the briefing room at the standard arrival time, not early, not late, at the protocol's specified time, and went directly to the secondary consultation tier's assigned seating and sat and opened the briefing materials on the display. He did not survey the room. He did not engage in the pre-briefing social exchange that most attendees use the arrival period for. He reviewed the briefing materials with the attention of someone for whom the materials were the point rather than a courtesy, which was the attention of someone who had come to a briefing to attend the briefing. He was 61 years old. The age was in the physical record of his face and hands, and the specific way of sitting that bodies developed over decades of operational work. The particular economy of movement that long service produced, the absence of the unnecessary adjustments that younger officers made in formal settings, because they had not yet developed the certainty that the setting did not require them. His uniform was the Joint Authority's Senior Advisor designation with the standard service markings, not undecorated, but not the maximum expression of his service record, which a decorated officer of his age would typically carry at a strategic consultation briefing. The decoration was present in the way of something that was accurate rather than the way of something that was being communicated. Sora assessed him in the way she assessed the room, completely, and with the genuine professional attention she brought to briefings. And the assessment went where her preliminary assessment had pointed, which was the category she had formed from the designation and the unfamiliar name. The assessment was wrong in the specific way of accurate category application to the wrong object, which was the version of wrong that was hardest to identify, because the category was right, and the application was confident, and the confidence prevented the further observation that would have revised it. She did not further observe. She returned to her own briefing preparation, which was thorough and current, and was the preparation of someone who was genuinely excellent at her work, and the briefing began. The briefing's first segment ran for 42 minutes and covered the Taren sector's strategic overview with the density of a well-prepared joint command briefing. The volatility assessment, the revised framework's operational parameters, the current force disposition, and its alignment with the revised framework's requirements. Sora contributed 3 observations in the first segment, all of them operationally specific, all of them rooted in her 2 years in the Taren sector's command structure. The first was received and integrated without comment, which was the reception of an observation that had been anticipated and confirmed. The second produced a brief exchange with the primary tactical specialist that resolved in the direction of Sora's observation, which was accurate. The third prompted a revision of the briefing's operational parameter display that the chair acknowledged as a substantive contribution to the sector's current picture. She was doing good work, and it was good work, and it was received as good work. Commander Vel Thoras transitioned to the second segment at the 43-minute mark. He said, "Strategic Consultation Tier Contributions." The second segment's function is the broader contextual perspective on the revised framework's implications beyond the immediate operational period. Senior Advisor Sols, please begin. Garen looked up from the briefing materials with the quality of someone who has been in the materials and is now in the room. The transition from the reading to the speaking made without preparation, because the preparation was the reading. He said, "The revised framework's third operational phase has a structural feature that resembles the configuration used in the Verath border stabilization period. Specifically, the graduated presence model, where defensive positioning is reduced incrementally as compliance indicators are met. The Verath stabilization's third phase produced a predictable exploitation window at the 40% reduction mark, when the incremental changes had been sufficient to affect deterrence, but insufficient to have been replaced by the compliance relationship, the model assumed. The briefing documentation doesn't address this window. I'd recommend the framework's third phase include a specific monitoring protocol for the 40% interval. He delivered this in approximately 90 seconds. The delivery was the delivery of someone who had identified a specific thing and was communicating the specific thing, not building toward it, not framing it, not establishing the contribution's importance before making it. The thing and then done. Sora looked at the briefing documentation's third phase section while Garen was speaking and found it was accurate that the documentation didn't address the window he was describing. She also found that the Verath border stabilization was not in her briefing preparation's reference materials, because her preparation had covered the current sector's history and the immediately preceding operational periods rather than historical precedents from what she was assessing as outside the relevant range. She said, "The Verath stabilization was 3 decades ago. The compliance monitoring technology and enforcement capabilities in the current framework are substantially different from what was available in that period. The exploitation window you're describing may not transfer to the current context." The register in which she said this was the register that was technically within the briefing's professional norms. The contribution she was challenging was not obviously wrong. She was applying a legitimate analytical question, the transferability of historical precedent to current operational context, but she was applying it through a register that communicated something about her assessment of the contribution's source as well as her assessment of the contribution's content. And the two things were present in the delivery, and were both audible to everyone in the room, even if only one of them was the stated content. Garen received it. He did not produce a visible response, not tension, not the adjustment that people made when receiving something personal in a professional register, not any of the things that would have communicated that he had received the personal element. He received it in the way of someone receiving a professional observation about a professional contribution, which was what it was technically, and he considered it. He said, "The technology is different. The structural dynamic isn't. Graduated presence models create the same vulnerability at the same interval regardless of the monitoring capability, because the vulnerability is in the relationship between deterrence and compliance, not in the monitoring. The technology changes what you can see at the interval. It doesn't change whether the interval is exploitable." He said this in the same 90-second delivery register. The thing and then done. Commander Vel Thoras had been looking at the display during the exchange. He looked at Sora for a moment with the quality of someone who was about to say something, and then he looked at Garen for a moment with the quality of someone who was deciding how to say it, and then he looked at the briefing room and said, "Before we continue, I want to ensure the room has the correct context for this contribution, for the record's completeness." He said it in the register of operational accuracy rather than any other register, which was the register that prevented it from being anything other than what it was, which was the chair ensuring the briefing's participants had the information the briefing required. He stated the number, 41 years of active service. Commander Vel Thoras said it the way he said everything, which was with the specific flatness of someone for whom information was information, and whose function was its accurate transmission. He did not pause after the first figure. He moved through the accounting in the sequence the record provided, which was the sequence of years and campaigns and operations, and the sequence had the quality of a thing being built from its components rather than the quality of a revelation, because the chair was not producing a revelation. He was producing an accurate record, and the record built itself in the room as it was stated. 19 active conflict zones. Sora was looking at the display when the number began. She continued looking at the display for the first two figures, which was the behavior of someone who was receiving information in the peripheral way while her attention was on something else. By the third figure, she was no longer looking at the display. 11 campaigns from inception to conclusion. The room had the quality of people receiving information that was updating their assessments in real time. The junior officers, the two secondary tactical staff, who were attending the briefing in the observation tier, had the specific quality of young people receiving a number that exceeded the category they had available for it. They did not have the operational experience to calculate the number against their own records, which was the calculation the senior officers were making, and so they received it in a more direct way, which was as a thing that was large without a comparative frame, and large without a comparative frame had its own kind of weight. 37 evacuation operations personally commanded. The Vareth senior command officers in the room were doing the calculation Sora had not yet gotten to because she was still in the receiving. The calculation was their own records against the number. The calculation produced, in the senior officers' expressions, the specific quality of people who had been in the room confident in their own experience, and who were now doing arithmetic that was not producing a result that supported the confidence, not because their experience was insufficient, but because the number they were calculating against was what it was, and arithmetic was arithmetic. 214 personnel extractions under direct fire. The specific nature of this figure was different from the others in the accounting. Campaigns and conflict zones and evacuation operations were in the register of the operational record, significant figures in a professional account. 214 personnel extractions under direct fire was a figure in a different register, which was the register of individual decisions made individually, at the specific moment when a specific person needed to be brought out of a specific situation, and the person doing the bringing was under fire. The figure aggregated those moments, but the aggregation did not remove the individual quality of each moment, which was the quality of a decision made at the cost of exposure to the person making it, 214 times, and each time successfully. 6 systems defended against forces rated superior, by the Joint Command's own assessment. The chair said this with the same flatness, but this figure had a different reception in the room from the preceding ones. Defended against forces rated superior was a phrase that the Joint Command used in specific circumstances to describe outcomes that the pre-engagement assessment had not assigned high probability to, which meant the phrase was the operational record's way of saying, "This should not have worked and it worked 6 times. Currently active record with no unresolved operations." This was the final element of the accounting, and it was the element that had the most specific quality in the way it landed. No unresolved operations meant that in 41 years of the above, the 19 conflict zones, the 11 campaigns, the 37 evacuations, the 214 extractions, the 6 defended systems, there was no operation that had ended with personnel left behind, no situation that had been abandoned rather than concluded, no moment that had been walked away from rather than through. 41 years. No unresolved operations. The room received the completed accounting in the specific quality of a room that has received something, and is, in the interval before it has fully processed it, which was the interval where the thing was simply present without the response to it. Sora was in the interval. She was looking at Garen Sols with the full version of her attention, not the observational attention of the initial assessment, which had been from the category toward the person, but the specific attention of someone who had been looking at a thing through a category and had received information that had removed the category and was now looking at the thing itself for the first time. He looked like what he was. She understood this now. The economy of movement was not the economy of age. It was the economy of 41 years of operational work, which removed everything unnecessary because unnecessary things cost something, and the 41 years had taught, across every operation, exactly what things cost and exactly which costs were worth bearing. The quiet with which he had entered the room and gone directly to the materials was not the quiet of someone without standing. It was the quiet of someone who had been in enough rooms that rooms did not require management, which was a quality that was produced by a specific kind of experience and not by anything else. The uniform's decoration, which she had read as understated in the way of someone not presenting their full record, she now read correctly, which was as the decoration of someone who had never needed to present their full record, because the record was not the presentation. It was simply what the record was, and anyone who needed to know it would find it in the documents, and the documents were not on the uniform. She had read the uniform as a presentation of insufficient decoration. The uniform was the absence of the need to present anything, which was produced by having something that was past the need for presentation, which was the quality of a record so long and so specific that the uniform was simply a uniform, correct and present. The way the person wearing it was simply present, not performing, not presenting, simply there. She had been in the room with this for 20 minutes before the accounting began. She had assessed it as the category of people who had done significant things in the past. The past was 41 years long and was not, in any meaningful sense, the past. The briefing continued. This was the first thing Sora understood in the aftermath of the accounting, that the briefing continued, because the briefing's function was the briefing, and the briefing's function did not pause for the room's recalibration, and the room's recalibration was the room's business, and the briefing's continuation was everyone's function. Commander Vel Thoras transitioned from the accounting back to the second segment's continuation, with the flatness of someone for whom the accounting had been a required element of the briefing's accurate conduct, and which, having been provided, could be followed by the next required element. She returned her attention to the briefing, which was what her function required. She returned it with the recalibration in progress, which was a different quality of attention from the quality she had brought to the first segment. The recalibration was not resolved. Recalibrations of the kind that the accounting had produced were not resolved in the 20 minutes remaining of the second segment, because they were the kind that required the time they required, and which could not be rushed without being falsified. But it was honest, which was the quality it needed to be useful rather than merely uncomfortable. The second segment continued. Two other consultation tier contributors offered their perspectives on the revised framework's implications, and Sora received them with the professional attention the briefing required and contributed where her operational knowledge was relevant, and did not contribute where it wasn't, which was the correct behavior and which she had been doing throughout and continued to do. Garen did not contribute again in the second segment after the exchange. He had made his contribution, and the contribution had been made, and the accounting that followed it was the chair's function rather than his, and he received the accounting's aftermath with the same quality as everything else, present, attending, in the room without managing the room. The third segment addressed operational specifics of the revised framework's implementation timeline, and was primarily the primary command tier's work rather than the consultation tiers. Sora was active in the third segment because the implementation timeline was the segment that her 2 years in the sector were most directly applicable to, and she contributed accurately and was useful. At the third segment's 40-minute mark, she became aware of looking at the briefing documentation's third phase section and Garen's observation about the 40% reduction interval, which was the observation she had challenged in the register she had used. She was looking at it with the intelligence she had applied to her briefing preparation, the same intelligence, the same standard, and the observation held at that standard. The graduated presence model's structural vulnerability at the 40% reduction mark was real. The historical precedent was applicable in the way Garen had said it was applicable, which was at the level of the structural dynamic rather than the technological environment. The current framework's monitoring technology was better than the Verath stabilizations. The structural dynamic was the same. She had been right that the technology was different. She had been wrong about what the technology being different meant for the observation's relevance. She noted the revision in her operational assessment with the honesty she brought to revisions that the briefing's 15% produced, which was the honesty of someone who took their professional work seriously enough that being wrong was information rather than wound, and information was useful, and being wrong was therefore an event that had value rather than one that had to be managed. She would add the third phase's 40% monitoring protocol to her operational recommendations. The framework's documentation should be revised. She would raise it in the post-briefing follow-up. The briefing concluded at the standard time. Commander Vel Thoras provided the summary and the action items, and the next session's schedule with the efficient precision of someone who conducted good briefings and knew how to conclude them. The room transitioned from the briefing's formal register to the post-briefing's informal register, people gathering their materials, the conversation beginning in the sideline mode of people at the end of a substantive session, finding the threads they wanted to continue. She gathered her materials. She looked at where Garen was, which was in the same position he had occupied for the briefing. Gathering his materials with the economy of movement she was now reading correctly, preparing to leave the room with the same quality as everything else. She had a choice about what to do with the recalibration. The choice was, leave the room with the recalibration in progress and address it later, which was the option that was less uncomfortable and which was not the right option. Or address it in the room, which was the right option and which was uncomfortable in the specific way of doing the right thing in the moment when it was required rather than at the later and more convenient moment when it was easier. She walked across the briefing room. She was aware of the room's other occupants being aware of her crossing, which was the awareness she was going to carry, and which was correct to carry, because the exchange she was initiating was the exchange she should have initiated, and the carrying of the awareness was part of the correct behavior. She said to Garen, the observation about the third phase, the 40% interval. He looked at her. He was in the room with the full attending quality and was looking at her with it. She said, "You were right about the structural dynamic. I assess the technology differential as the relevant variable and it isn't. The structural dynamic is the relevant variable and the technology differential doesn't change it. He said, yes, she said. The challenge I made was in the wrong register. He looked at her for a moment. He said, you made a legitimate analytical point about technological transferability. It was the wrong application of the point. She said, the register communicated more than the analytical point. He said, yes. She held this. She said, I read the category rather than the record. He said, most people do at first. The category is visible and the record requires the documents. She said, the documents are thorough. He said, 41 years produces thorough documentation. She said, yes. She looked at him with the quality she had not brought to the initial assessment, which was the quality of someone looking at the thing itself rather than through the category. And what she saw was what she had described to herself in the room during the accounting. The quality of someone who was past the need for presentation, present and functional, and in the room for the work, which was where the 41 years had always put him, and where the current briefing had been no exception. She said, the monitoring protocol for the 40% interval. I'm going to add it to the post-briefing follow-up recommendations. He said, the implementation team will need the Verath stabilization specific Phase 3 documentation as the precedent reference. I can have it sent to your operational file, she said. I'd appreciate that. He said, it'll be there this afternoon. She said, Senior Advisor Sols. She said it in the register of one officer to another, which was the correct register and which was the register she should have used from the beginning. She said, thank you for the contribution. He said, thank you for the revision. He said it without emphasis and without irony, and in the same register she had used, which was the register of one officer to another. And it was the most precisely accurate thing that could have been said in the specific exchange they had just had, which was an exchange in which she had done a recalibration correctly, and he had acknowledged the correctness of it in the way that correctness deserved, which was directly and without ceremony, and in the register of professional work that had been done as professional work was supposed to be done. She walked back across the briefing room toward the exit. She was aware of Commander Vel Thoras watching her with the specific quality of someone who had chaired a briefing and had watched it produce something at its margins that the briefing's function had not included, but which the briefing had needed. He said quietly as she passed, the Verath stabilization documentation is also in the standard historic precedent archive. File reference 7 alpha comparative. She said, I know now. He said, yes, now you do. She went out into the corridor with the recalibration in its current state, which was honest and was in progress and would continue in progress for the time it needed. And the time it needed was not her to determine, but the recalibrations to take. And the recalibration's requirement was what it was. She thought about the 15%, about the revisions that the briefing's 15% had always produced, about the consistent direction of the revisions, that the categories she was most confident about were the categories most likely to require revision. She thought about why that was, which was the thought that was available now and had not been available before the accounting, or had been available and had not been reached. The category was confident because she was good at applying it. She was good at applying it because she had applied it correctly many times. She had applied it correctly many times because the category was usually the right category. And the category being usually the right category was the specific thing that prevented further observation of the times when it was the wrong category. Because usually right categories felt like reliable tools, and reliable tools were not the things you inspected carefully. They were the things you used. The tools she was most confident in were the tools she inspected least. She was 34 years old and had 8 years of command briefings, and she was genuinely excellent at her work, and she had just revised one of her most confident categories in the presence of the most significant counter-evidence she had encountered, and the revision had required 41 years of a documented record to produce it. She thought about the 214 personnel extractions under direct fire, the individual quality of that figure, which was the aggregate of 214 individual moments, each one a specific person in a specific situation, requiring a specific decision made under fire by the specific person making it. She thought about no unresolved operations, which was the specific language of the record that had the most specific quality in its landing. 41 years. No unresolved operations. She had been in the room with this for 20 minutes before the accounting and had looked at it and had applied the category and had not seen it. She understood now what the station commander had said to the new lieutenant about the gap, that the gap was not the problem, and the gap became the problem if you let it make you smaller or larger than the work required. She had let the category make her confident in the absence of sufficient information, which was a specific kind of larger than the work required, and the accounting had shown her the specific quality of the error with the specific clarity of documented evidence. She was going to be a better officer for it. Not because the accounting had reduced her, it hadn't, and her work was genuinely good, and the goodness was not reduced by the revision, but because the revision was accurate, and accurate revisions to wrong assessments were the material that improvement was made of. She walked through the Frontier Station's corridors toward her operational section, and she thought about the third phase's 40% interval, and she thought about the monitoring protocol, and she thought about the Verath's